Hi Chess.com, this is FM Alyssa Melahina back for the third and final part of my video series on Tal's 10 most brilliant sacrifices. In the first part, we looked at his 3 most brilliant queen sacrifices. Then we took a look at some of his most beautiful miniatures. Now, the previous sacrifices showcased his ability to tactically demolish his opponent. Mate was often the goal. However, in the examples of this part of the series, which will focus on his most brilliant positional sacrifices, we're going to take a look at another side of Tal. Here, his sacrifices were more so designed to exploit the weaknesses in his opponent's position. Because, of course, it would be great if Tal could always play with the initiative, but his opponents were savvy and they didn't always allow him to play that type of game. So in these examples, we'll take a look at how he still managed to sacrifice, even if it was for a positional gain. And in these cases, even though he still got an attack, Mate was more so a byproduct of the positional sac. And these examples will also be more practical than the previous ones because you'll probably get more opportunities to sacrifice for positional gain than to execute a queen sacrifice. This will highlight Tal's diversity because you can't be world champion based purely on tactics. So he did have a great mastery over other aspects of chess, especially his ability to feel and control the position. And that's what separated him from contemporaries such as Nizhmedinov, who was more of a pure tactician. So let's take a look. First positional sacrifice against Bent Larsen from the candidates in 1965. Again, we're not going to focus too much on the opening here. We have a Schrennigan Sicilian. Okay, queen b8, knight b5, the purpose of which was to displace the queen. And you'll notice that in Tal's games, his opponents, for some reason, seem to have their pieces lining up on the back rank, and he was great at taking advantage of that. So he provoked some weaknesses, moved the knight back to d4. Now this bishop poised on Tal's favorite long diagonal. He has all of his pawns in the center, ready to go. And now's the time to get things moving along. Okay, bishop d3. Remember we went over those patient moves, putting the pieces on their optimal squares from the previous examples. Look, this bishop pair is going to be very dangerous. Okay, b4, black is brewing his own attack here. So take a pause and think about how you would continue. Knight d5. So this is Tal's brilliant sacrifice number 7. Now, black is pretty much forced to take here. But this piece sacrifice is a positional one. So there's no immediate mate threat on h7 or g7. The purpose of this sacrifice was to simply open up the e-file. Tal is going to follow up and put a rook on e1. And black can't block this e-file because the e6 and e5 squares are controlled by white's pawns. So this came out of the blue. And you see knight d5 a lot in the Sicilian, but that's usually when black's king is still in the center on e8. Here black is castled. So let's see how he takes advantage of this. Okay, now black may have been surprised by this, and he reacted by playing f5. So of course he was probably worried that white would continue maybe with h4, f5 himself, or he wanted to block the b1, h7 diagonal for the bishop on d3. So he played h5, seemingly to want to take advantage of the extra piece, but now white takes control of the e-file. And here the correct move was bishop d8. Now, does this remind you of something? Well, remember the Smyslov miniature that I went over from part 2 where black's bishop also retreated to d8 and that did not end well. But here, this was the correct defensive move. And instead, black played rook f7, defending the bishop, but the rook is misplaced on f7. And remember, another one of Tal's secrets to his success was that he was a master of misplacing his opponent's pieces. We're going h4, continuing with the attack. Now, the problem with taking on f5 immediately is that after bishop takes f5, black can go knight f8, and he regains some control of the position. So Tal was not hasty. He did not take on f5 just yet, playing h4. Okay, now black has to develop, so one bishop b7, and now Tal took on f5, because now knight f8 is no longer an issue. So we get a pawn. Notice this rook on the 7th, always dangerous. So it looks like black can retreat to f7 and protect the 7th rank, but pause and take a moment to consider how white would proceed here. Well, the black rook is one of black's only defenders against the king, so if he had won rook f7, then white can open up the position like this, and black can take on h5 because mate in 5 will follow. Okay, so black needs to keep the extra rook on f5. Instead, he decided it was time to sacrifice the piece back, because it's either rook f7 here or knight e5 to defend from this threat of taking on g7. Go knight e5. Now, white can't take the knight on e5 just yet, so we go queen e4 attacking the rook. Now white can take on e5, and it's not a good idea to take on b7 because black has his own threats. He's coming in. And this would be a checkmate. White took the right piece. Okay, now he's defending the rook on e7 indirectly, so it's important that he retreats the queen and still maintains a threat on the rook, so that once black does take on e7, he can take back. So it looks like Tal escaped unharmed, even after he sacrificed a knight on d5. This wins the e5 pawn easily. Okay, so this is the last tactical flourish of this game. Black just doubled up on the d file, aiming for this d5 pawn. He does have drawing chances here, so how would you defend this d5 pawn? Queen f4 is the move, and it prevents bishop takes d5 because of rook e8 check. So after queen f4, black is just 2 pawns down, and white finishes him off easily. Bent Larsen, of course, a strong player. So let's just take a look at how Tal converted. And Tal finishes the game in his typical style. Even though it started with the positional sacrifice, we do get a mating tactic at the end. Okay, that game was played in the candidates match of 1965. We're going to backtrack a little bit to the 1960 World Championships against Botvinnik. This is round 6 of the match, and this is a clash of two styles because Botvinnik was the calmer positional player, whereas Tal really thrived in chaos. Even so, even if he didn't have a direct mating attack against Botvinnik, he still executed what I consider to be a phenomenal positional sacrifice. Okay, now if you're looking to change up your repertoire to play like Tal, I highly recommend playing the King's Indian for black. This is what we see happening in this game. I've been playing the King's Indian for a very long time myself, and it gives black excellent tactical chances. And one of the reasons is because white's pawn center is inflated, and this usually allows sacrifices through the point of d4. A lot of times you go f5, f4. Here, Tal played c6, which is a very useful, flexible move. And as a King's Indian player, I love seeing the move d5 because it means that white eliminates the tension in the center. and he closes up the position, but now that means that black's pieces can spring to life, and he can take advantage of the structure, which is the essence of the King's Indian. Okay, so typical knight outpost on c5. Okay, now white maneuvered the knight to d3 just to exchange that strong knight on c5, because the purpose of the knight on c5 is also to put pressure on the e4 pawn, which can amplify if black gets the chance to play f5. Okay, but now black takes control of the c-file, and apparently black had the idea for the sacrifice he executed all the way back here on move 14, and I'm not going to tell you what that sacrifice is because I'm going to ask you to find it in a moment. Okay, now we saw this maneuver by Tal before, knight f6 to h5, aiming at the g3, f4 squares, and opening up the bishop. And even though there is a pawn on e5, if white ever plays f4, the bishop will open, and this allows black to play f5, f4, and sacrifice a pawn on f4 for the purpose of opening up the bishop. Oh, so see, Tal is always moving forward. Again with the rookless, again with moving forward and taking control of the 4th and 5th ranks in interesting ways. Okay, so we double up on the c-file. So all of black's pieces look pretty active here, except for the typical King's Indian bishop on g7. So that means that now is the time to play f5 and try to go f4, get the bishop open, make use of the bishop. And the bishop is a good defender from behind. If the files ever get opened, black's king is usually safe. Okay, now it's a good time for f5 because before we couldn't go f5 because white could either take on f5 with the pawn and black can't take back, g takes f5 because the knight is hanging thanks to the queen. And other times if black takes back with the bishop, then white can go g4. But here, because white put his rook on b1, g4 is not really an option. Okay, so after this, white played rook a1. So now pause the video and think about how you would continue the attack here. Okay, knight f4. Now I did mention that f5, f4 was an idea, but knight f4, this is something purely out of Tal's mind. Can you imagine this move being played in a world championship match? Okay, now, knight f4, if it weren't threatened, is a very powerful move in and by itself because, look, we have a double attack on the queen and on the bishop, and also on this d3 square. So the knight is a great piece there. You almost have no choice but to take it. We're going to take back. And it's not that you're trapping the bishop. Okay, that's not the point of the sacrifice. Again, this is the video, part of the video series on positional sacrifices. So we're taking advantage of the structure, the position itself. And with this, black, look at the creative way in which black opened up this bishop on g7. Okay, and the bishop is not just aiming for the a1 diagonal, but it's most useful if it can get to e5 and then aim for h2. So apparently Tal valued the activity of the bishop that much. Okay, now this is a famous game, and it has been suggested that a3 is the way to go here for white, that this was one of Tal's typical unsound sacrifices, and this is the way that white should have continued on. And black still has some compensation here. It is complicated, though, and I'm going to try and explain why a3 is the right move. It's very subtle, and it's very difficult for white to find, especially in that type of pressure. Almost impossible. So if bishop takes a7, white played bishop d2 in the game. We'll see what happened there. But this is the correct way to go. You have to take the a7 pawn. You just have to go in for the complications. So bishop e5, f3 to prevent the discovered attack. Now b6 threatens to trap the bishop. So queen a5 is a threat. Next move. But if we change it up a bit and play a3 first, Then black almost has to go to queen b3. And now when we take on a7 and continue with this b6, well, now we're not threatening to trap the bishop anymore. Now white has time to throw in a4, a5, and open up the bishop. But again, I mean, this is such a subtle point, and I can't imagine anyone really finding this over the board. But even so, Botvinnik didn't play in the most active way. He went back to d2, and this allowed black to take on b2. Okay, so rook b1, it looks like this was his plan to at least get control of the b file, because taking on b1 is not that great for black here. It's not worth it to give white so much activity, even if it means getting an exchange out of it. So instead, what move did Tal play here? So f3, opening up even more lines. Apparently, according to the record of this game, this is where Botvinnik started to actually turn red. So white took on b2 here. Bishop takes f3 was correct. Botvinnik was probably so dismayed he didn't go in for it. But he would have had some chances here, and the point of f3 first was to give black the chance to go bishop e5 check in the critical lines and to stop white's queen from coming into e6. Instead of going into this, he just took the queen and decided to simplify the game, and that was the mistake. So black is better. He has 2 pawns for a knight. And even here, he keeps attacking. So he tried to defend. The game lasted for about 10 to 15 more moves. But black eventually managed to convert here. So excellent positional sacrifice by black. White did not handle it in the best way and just very quickly found himself losing and giving back the material. And you see a lot of Tal's opponents trying to do that, trying to simplify and get out of the calculations. But as I mentioned before, Tal was also a deep calculator and great at mastering the position. Now, that game was played in 1960, and those were Tal's glory years. Late 1950s to 60s and 70s. Now we're going to take a look at a game that was played all the way in 1987, but it was against none other than Anatoly Karpov. And it was a blitz game, but it's probably my most favorite of all of Tal's sacrifices, so that's why I saved the best for last. And it's purely a positional sacrifice. And he dismantled Karpov very easily with it. So again, you see Tal trying very creative weapons against the Caro-Kann. He always knew how to get the type of positions that he wanted. Bishop g5, it looks like that's his favorite square for the dark squared bishop. So Karpov possibly wants to place the bishop on d5, and that would make it difficult for white to kick it back with c4, because then black could take on f3 and hit the d4 pawn. But black's pieces are awkwardly placed here. The rook on e8 is very inactive, and white does have a strong pawn center, so pause and consider what Tal played here. Okay, rook takes e6. If you face this in the blitz match yourself, this is something that you should just play without even thinking. Look, black has doubled pawns, light squares are weak, and this bishop on d3 is going to be a monster. In fact, Tal followed up with bishop c4 next move, putting black on the defensive, again taking control of those open lines. Black has to defend the pawn with e6. Now, is it just me, or is it something about getting his opponents to retreat to d8? Now, I've just noticed that whenever black puts a piece on d8, things just tend to end badly, and this disrupts the coordination between black's rooks, so it doesn't really matter that Black has an extra rook for a bishop in this game. So, continuing to pile up on the pawn. And knight d2 starting to regroup the pieces, putting the knight on a better square. Okay, now Black wants to activate his own pieces, and if he is able to get away with exchanging the d4 pawn, then he may be able to take advantage of White's own weakness, which is the backward c3 pawn. So how would you dominate the light squares in this position? You go h4 because the only thing protecting Black's king other than the bishop at the moment is these two pawns. And I mean, White's bishop is very well suited to attack those pawns, but you need to pry them open. So h4, h5 is a very strong idea here. Well, of course, Tal doesn't mind sacking that pawn. So we go h5. Okay, now how would you continue the attack here? Okay, Tal played a queen takes h5, but if you saw knight f6, then you saw a better move than Tal even did, because this actually wins much quicker. We can take on h7. Black cannot recapture because queen takes h5, checkmate, but if Black tries to defend, then he can't stop the mate either way. So rook takes e7. Again, thanks to this bishop very well placed on g5 as usual. But surprisingly, Tal didn't see knight f6. Instead, he went for the more natural follow-up, queen takes h5, but he still won in very good style. I mean, the point of this game within this part of the series is to showcase his positional sacrifices. So I wouldn't have used this as a miniature because it wasn't as accurate, but you'll see how he went for the sack on e6 and how he used the light squares to his advantage and the positional defects in Black's position to his advantage. So it looks like a rook sack, but it's also a discovery. Okay, now I'm going to ask you if you can find the defense for Black here. Karpov played h6, but the only defensive move here was bishop h6. Believe it or not, bishop h6 allowing Black to defend h7 with rook f7 after taking on h6. Instead, Karpov played h6, and this allowed White to finish him off very easily. So what a way to finish Karpov off. And this is Tal's Most Brilliant Sacrifice number 10. So this concludes my video series on Tal sacrifices. And in this part of the series, I tried to showcase Tal's ability to sacrifice for a positional advantage. He was world champion after all. He had a great command of all aspects of chess. And I hope that you were able to see a different side of him in this part on the positional sacrifices, but that you also overall from the series came away with a sense of inspiration in seeing Tal's games and that you enjoyed going through them with me. So I hope you feel invigorated to add some spice to your own chess games moving forward. And please comment your favorite Tal sacrifices or any contemporary sacrifices. The top players nowadays that I see channeling Tal are players such as Shabalov, Sutovsky, Judith Polgar, of course. So his legacy lives on. He is one of the greatest players, one of my chess heroes. Thanks again so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. This is Alyssa Melahina signing off.